Chapter 14. The Chatty Forest. The trees cast long shadows across the leaf-covered ground when Colin woke up. His head was pounding. What happened? And then it all came rushing back. The werewolves, the dark. Wolf Alfred Talbot kidnapping him. And that it was all Colin's fault. Talbot had left the message in his living room, not his grandmother. Who knows how else he had been using him. And then there was Principal Sampson. Colin had been right all along. He had to be the other person who had been helping Talbot. It made too much sense not to be him. The sun was beginning to set. There was only an hour or so before his final full moon change. Colin had to get to the base and warn the others before. Pick it up. Alfred's final words rang through Colin's mind. The wizard's walking stick still sat where he dropped it. Colin picked it up, and as soon as his hand touched the polished wood, the forest spun around him like a deranged amusement park ride. Leaves swirled, and the sound of branches clacking together was almost deafening. The forest slowed its insane spinning and came to a stop as the whirling leaves came together in front of Colin and began to create a shape. It looked just like Alfred, only made completely out of leaves. The leaf version of the old wizard reached out and took the walking stick from Colin's hands. "Hello, Colin, my dear boy," said Leafy Alfred, but his voice sounded more like the rustling of leaves. "Alfred? Is that really you?" "Not really, no. I knew you needed answers, but I also knew that Talbot was about to take me. So I temporarily split my mind and placed part of it in my walking stick, allowing me to appear before you for a brief time so we can speak. I didn't have much time to work the magic, so I can only grant you 3 questions. Use them wisely." 3 questions? Colin really didn't know what to ask, but figured he should start with the obvious. Who is Damon Talbot? Leafy Alfred leaned on his walking stick. He was a resident of Elkwood, a young wizard who was very strong when it came to affecting people's minds. His was much like my own magic. As senior magical members of Elkwood, it fell to your grandmother and me to teach young Damon. And we did. But it was never enough for the boy. Above all else, Damon craved power. The leaves began to blow apart, then quickly rejoined again. Damon grew to hate Elkwood. He saw it as a place full of powerful people and creatures who were living a lie, trying to be normal. Although his powers of the mind grew, he wasn't as strong in other areas. Not like young Miss Emerson, for example. In a fit of anger, he attempted a complicated spell that allowed him to harness magical energy for a short period of time. And like any young, angry boy, he tried to use the power to destroy. And that is the danger of having too much power too fast. Colin adjusted the tweed jacket, which was still wrapped firmly around his waist. Alfred's story was something Colin feared for himself and had spoken to Silas about a number of times. He had all this power all of a sudden as a werewolf. What if it were used for evil? What if one day Colin couldn't help himself? This very problem was the reason Silas hunted his own kind. So few werewolves stay good. Your grandmother and I stopped Damon and broke the spell, continued Alfred, with a rustle of his leafy body. He was never the same after that. His hatred for Elkwood grew, as did his anger toward your grandmother and me and the rest of the special people in our town. One night he simply disappeared. No one could locate him, not even our demon friend. Alfred rustled a little and then stood quietly, waiting. Colin pondered what to ask next. Would Alfred know where his grandmother was being kept? Should he ask about Charles and his final words? What's a hellstone? Ah, a very good question. Damon now claims to be a sorcerer, but he's nothing of the sort. His power comes from the hellstone he wears around his neck. No one has ever seen one before, as far as I know. They're a myth, or so I thought. A rock from hell itself. If the stories are true, a hellstone not only grants the wearer vast amounts of power, but it also allows its master to steal power from others. A word of warning though, my dear boy. You cannot touch the hellstone. No one can. It will burn and consume anyone that touches it with bare skin. Nothing on earth can survive its touch. Colin wanted to ask so much more, but time was running short and he had only one more question. The most important question. How do I defeat him? A few leaves blew off the figure of the old man and his form began to waver. Damon's plan appears to center around the kidnapping of powerful people in Elkwood. I can only assume it's to steal our magic for himself. But the Hellstone only grants power to the person wearing it. If Damon no longer wears the stone, all his borrowed power would vanish. Separate the stone from wearer, and he'll just be a wizard again. Good luck, young Mr. Strauss. The leaves exploded in a gust of wind and Alfred's walking stick fell to the ground. How can I get the stone off of him if I can't touch the thing? Shouted Colin to the retreating leaves. But there was no answer. Just the whistling of the wind through the trees. It wasn't time for the full moon change yet, but Colin had to get back to the army base. He had to tell Varsun what was happening. He thought wolfy thoughts, and let the change rip through him. He was running before he knew it, taking long strides, galloping across the forest floor toward Elkwood. The sense of the other werewolves caused flashes to appear in his mind. He saw the other werewolves felt their hunger. They'd come this way not long ago. They were also heading toward Elkwood. Colin had to hurry. Time was running out. The base was busy when Colin leapt from the shadows of the forest and landed in the middle of the yard. Several soldiers turned their guns on him. Put them down, shouted the jittery voice of Elric Varsun. Colin, thank goodness you're okay. Colin didn't much like the idea of changing in front of all these men, but he reluctantly reached for his human side and his body shrank, shedding hair around him that disintegrated. Bones clicked as they shrank in his muscles, and organs settled themselves back into their usual places. His stomach grumbled with hunger. A soldier tossed Colin a blanket, which he quickly wrapped around himself. We have to get you inside, said Varsun, placing a hand on Colin's shoulder. There was a strange smell in the air. It was something like burned rubber. Colin shook his head and tried to focus. We need to talk, said Colin. Of course, as soon as we get you down to the prison level, said Varsun, guiding Colin inside the base. There's no time for that. It's Talbot, he's... Colin felt the needle jab into his neck and watched Varsun take a few steps back. The world became far too swirly and Colin dropped to his knees. Warjado, Varsun? Varsun leaned down and smiled calmly. The smell of burned rubber. It was coming from Varsun. Something wasn't right. I'm sorry, Colin. Varsun isn't here right now, he said. Colin felt himself being hoisted up and moved into the elevator. He felt like he was floating. Werewolf. I'm a werewolf. He reached for his wolf creature. He'd teach them to look at all the pretty colors. When Colin woke up, he was on the floor of a cell in the base prison. His head felt heavy and sluggish and his mouth was dry. He was also hungry, ever so hungry. A familiar tingle ran up his spine. His full moon change wasn't far away. He struggled to his feet and leaned against the bars, the blanket still wrapped around him. Hello, said Varsun, standing on the other side of the bars. Don't worry. You were only out for a few minutes. Just a little tranquilizer with a bit of werewolf suppression fluid to keep you from turning all hairy while we got you down here. They have some splendid toys in this base. You're not Varsun, said Colin, the fog in his mind clearing a little. I am Varsun. Well, this is Varsun's body. I'm currently under mind control and can do nothing about it. Damon thought you might try something like alerting the base, so here I am. I'm afraid I'm not in control of myself at all. Colin looked around the room. Not much had changed. The same guard was at the center console flipping through a magazine. The same inmates as before occupied the cells. Terry was in the cell next door sleeping soundly. On the other side of Colin's cell, Bernie was dancing around in his little box. He seemed happy to see Colin. So what happens now? Said Colin, feeling at a loss. I'm going to go upstairs and make sure all the soldiers stay at the base. Tonight, we'll call it a training exercise. We don't want anyone interfering with what's about to happen in Elkwood tonight. Then I'll head down to the town hall meeting where all the freaks and special people will be gathered. And then what? Varsun shrugged. I have no idea. Those are my instructions, and I must follow them no matter how insane they are. Colin clutched the bars with both hands. This is Damon Talbot controlling. You, Varsun. You have to fight it. We have to get out of here. We have to find Becca and my grandmother and Alfred. Oh, don't worry about Becca. Damon's already taken care of her. And he has your friend Jeremy too. A bit of an extra insurance policy in case you tried to interfere tonight. Colin's insides began to burn. He reached for his inner wolf, but it wasn't there. Don't bother trying to change, said Varsun. I gave you enough suppressant to ensure you won't be able to change into a werewolf tonight. Full moon or no full moon. That stuff will pump through your blood all night and make sure nothing stands in Damon's way, which is a tragedy because someone really should stop him. Colin pounded his fists against the bars. Hey, said the guard. Calm down or I'll have to zap you. Varsun's being mind-controlled. Colin shouted. Sure he is, kid. Now pipe down. No one's going to believe you over me, Colin, said Varsun. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to go to a town hall meeting. Varsun walked down the cell block and entered the elevator. The doors closed. With a swish and he was gone. This was impossible. How could things have turned so bad so fast? Colin had seen it happening. Terry's meltdown, Micah attacking the teacher, Talbot appearing in Seattle. It was all part of a massive plan to steal the magic from Elkwood's most powerful residents. And then Talbot would unleash his werewolves upon the town. They'd never stand a chance. And Becca. He had Becca. And Jeremy. Colin slid down the bars to the floor. His wolf creature was hungry, but asleep. He could feel it. He just couldn't reach it. This was almost like the last time he had found himself a prisoner at the base, only this time he didn't have Silas nearby to help him, or his grandmother. Colin didn't know what to do and he felt tears well up in his eyes. Even before Silas had bitten him, he hadn't felt this helpless or this powerless. And now he had this ancient, powerful creature living inside of him. It was a part of him. And he still couldn't do anything to save the town, his friends, his family or his girlfriend. The purple dragon in a cell on the other side of the room let out a high-pitched roar that made the guard jump, drop his magazine and spill his coffee. Shut up, the guard yelled at the dragon, who simply huffed smoke in reply. Two ragged-looking vampires in another cell laughed. Even the massive troll, whose bulk filled most of his cell, laughed. It sounded like boulders in a rock crusher. The water tank full of black liquid in another cell stirred slightly. Quiet down, yelled the guard. I'll electrify all your cells if you keep this up. Then you'll really know what it's like to be imprisoned. The guard stalked off and disappeared through a door at the end of the block, muttering something about more coffee. Something at the back of Colin's memory sprang to life. He stood up and looked around the cell block. We're all in prison. What did Charles say? Free the imprisoned. Save Elkwood. How do I free the imprisoned? Colin felt the pressure in his cell change, as if it was about to rain. He turned and looked at the back of his cell. Something was coming through the wall. First, a leg stepped through as if the wall wasn't there at all, followed by the rest of the body, which was wearing a neat-looking suit. The fluorescent lights of the prison shone off the man's bald head, and his rosy cheeks sat comfortably on either side of his cheery grin. I think I might be of some assistance, said Principal Sampson. Chapter 15. The Imprisoned. Colin felt an overwhelming urge to hit the man. This was the man who had betrayed him, had betrayed Becca, Terry, Micah, and all of Elkwood. Colin swung a fist wildly at the cheerful little man. The punch never connected. In fact, his entire arm went through Principal Sampson. He stood awkwardly with his arm inserted through the grinning face, which remained unfazed. His arm felt extremely cold and so he pulled it back. Now I realize you may have a few questions, said Principal Sampson. A few? What are you? Asked Colin. Are you a hologram? I honestly don't know what that is. But that's because I'm very old, you see. Very old. As in I'm dead. I'm a ghost, Colin. I knew it. Becca said they didn't exist. The grave. You disappeared at the graveyard, and then your name was on the tombstone. The principal nodded. That is where I'm buried. Or rather, it's where my body is buried. As you can see, I'm not very attached to it anymore. The automatic doors in the school. Because you're a germaphobe. Because I'm dead and can't touch anything. Mr. Varsun and Mr. Emerson thought the doors to be a rather ingenious and creative solution that would allow me to move around the school. Colin passed a hand through the man again and the same creepy cold feeling rushed through his arm. But how does the automatic door know you're there? You're nothing but air. That's not entirely true. As a ghost I have a small corporeal form. It's not completely solid, but it prevents light from passing through me and allows my ghostly form to register on sensor-based devices. Like automatic doors. The principal shrugged. It saved a lot of messing around with magic. And if I focus my energy. Principal Sampson stared intently at his own finger and prodded Colin in the chest. It felt like a tiny stab of cold pushing against his body. I can sometimes even move things. How? Why? What? Said Colin, a little dumbfounded. You are a werewolf, are you not? Colin nodded. Then you know there are a lot of things that can't be explained. Ghosts are one of those things. Not everyone becomes a ghost, and sometimes those that do can't take any sort of form. I'm rather fortunate in that I'm able to look just the way I did when I was alive. I just can't touch anything. I can't feel. You don't have a heartbeat. And that's why I could never hear you when you moved. It all made sense. Not the part about ghosts existing, that was shocking and weird. But it made Colin feel a little less crazy knowing it wasn't his wolf powers that weren't working, or something else messing with his mind. Principal Sampson was simply dead. You're a very smart young man, Colin. I was asked to be the new school principal so I could keep an eye on the students. After what happened with Mr. Winter last year, and the terrible passing of Principal Mr. Emerson, thought it wise for me to assume the role, as I'm not bound by a lot of the same rules as humans. And good that I did. First that poor vampire and then Terry here. Principal Sampson motioned to Terry, who was still snoring. Elkwood really is in a lot of trouble. I've tried to help as best I can, but this is all truly beyond me. The town needs its resident teenage werewolf. I thought you were the one working with Damon Talbot. But it was Varson all along. Mr. Varson? Are you certain? Yes, he just left. He's under Talbot's control. He's been helping him this whole time. Oh, I don't think so. What is with you adults? You never believe anything we say, shouted Colin in frustration. Principal Simpson raised his hands in an apologetic gesture. If Mr. Varson is under the control of Damon Talbot, it's a new development. Talbot said someone else had been helping him. Someone in Elkwood has been feeding him essential information. That's correct. Ever since I was raised from my grave, I've been watching the town patrolling at night. Talbot has been communicating with someone else, though I imagine they're unaware of it. I saw them together one night. Admittedly, at the time I didn't know who Damon Talbot was. Who's the other person? Principal Sampson studied his feet. It's young Miss Emerson. Colin stared at the ghost. Becca? My girlfriend. It's not her fault. Talbot is a master of mind control, and with that hellstone there's no telling what he can do. Colin seethed and reached for his wolf creature. He wanted to change. He wanted to change right now, tear this cell to pieces and then hunt down Damon Talbot and eat him. Yes, eat him. But his wolf creature still wasn't there. No. Change happened. That's why Becca has been so tired lately. She thought it was because of her witch powers. He kidnapped my grandmother, and Alfred the wizard, and Charles the demon, and my girlfriend and my best friend. He's been using Becca this whole time. I have to stop him. An excellent suggestion. In my capacity as a ghost I'm a little limited, but I'm happy to assist in any way I can. What's the plan? A sense of determination flooded through Colin. Step 1, escape. Can you get me out of here? I believe I can, he said. Then we need to release all the other inmates too, said Colin, a hint of crazy edging into his voice. I'm sorry, said Principal Sampson. I think I misheard you. I swear you just said you wanted to release the other inmates. It was crazy. These prisoners were in here for a reason. They were dangerous. They were unpredictable. But Talbot was a planner. Being unpredictable right now is a good thing. Talbot has an army of werewolves in Elkwood right now. I can't fight them. Oh, and Charles the demon, the soothsayer, his final message to me was to release the imprisoned. He wanted me to release the inmates. He knew this future was a possibility. He must have seen it. Is there a step 3? asked Principal Sampson. I guess I need to convince them to help me, said Colin, a little unsure of himself. I don't suppose you know how to reverse the effects of the stuff they injected me with? I can't turn into a werewolf with this stuff pumping through my veins. The urge to change was strong, as was Colin's hunger. He felt the effects of the full moon and it agitated his body, but he still couldn't change. I'm sorry, I'm just a teacher and a ghost, not a doctor. I guess I'll figure that out as we go. Let's get started, said Colin. "Hey!" shouted the prison guard as he emerged from the back room with a fresh cup of coffee. "Who are you?" The guard ran to Colin's cell, spilling his coffee again, and pointed a finger at Principal Sampson. "How did you get in there?" "Excuse me, Colin," said the rosy-cheeked ghost and stepped past him and through the bars. The guard's eyes grew wide. How did you do that?" "I do apologize," said Principal Sampson, "but this is going to feel a little strange." Principal Sampson stepped into the guard's body and disappeared completely. The guard looked confused, then worried, then scared, and then he began to twitch. He moved around awkwardly, as if he wasn't in full control of his limbs. He staggered over to the control panel looking a little like a baby giraffe that was walking for the first time. He ran his fingers over a few buttons looking for the right one and flicked a switch. Colin's bars slid open. The other prisoners looked on with growing interest as the guard punched himself in the face and fell down unconscious. Principal Sampson floated out of the body and placed himself back on his feet. "Ugh, possessions always leave me feeling greasy," said Sampson. "That was amazing," said Colin. "Are you sure you want to release these people?" The troll had started banging his head against the bars in a slow rhythm. "Colin," said a sleepy voice from one of the cells. "Hi, Terry," said Colin, and he flicked a switch on the console. Terry's bars slid away into the ceiling. "Principal Sampson? What's going on?" asked Terry. Colin placed a hand on Terry's shoulder. "Terry, Elkwood is in serious trouble. I need you and the rest of the prisoners to work with me." Colin raised his voice so the others could hear him. "I need all of you to help me defeat the man who is about to attack our town." The troll continued to bang his head against the bars. The purple dragon curled up in the corner of its cell. The vampires turned away from the bars. They weren't listening to him. And why should they? He was just a kid. But he'd come so far. He wasn't that same loser from 6 months ago, the one who got beat up every day and lived in fear of everything. He was so much more. "I'm a werewolf. I can do this." Colin hopped up on the guard's chair. "Listen to me, you prisoners. I know. You're probably all in here because you did something bad, or maybe you're just too dangerous to live in town. This is the second time I've been in here. And, funnily enough, it's the second time I'm breaking out too. A man and a pack of bloodthirsty werewolves are about to destroy Elkwood. Whether you live in town or in a cage at the base, this is still your town. Fight with me. Fight with me to protect your home." There was a dramatic silence. The troll had stopped banging his head. The dragon watched Colin attentively. Even the creature in the giant tank of liquid peered out of the water with 2 large plate-sized yellow eyes. "It's working. I'm reaching them." Then the laughter started. The vampires were the first. Then the ogres joined. And then the troll. The sea creature clicked and bubbled in his tank, and even the dragon chuckled out a few bursts of smoke. Colin hopped down from his chair. "Well, that didn't work." "Don't be silly," said Principal Sampson. "That was an excellent speech. They just need the right motivation." He winked and then disappeared in a wisp of smoke. The temperature began to drop instantly and Colin could see his breath. The pressure in the room was fluctuating wildly. "Colin," said Terry, clutching at Colin's sleeve. "What's happening?" "I have no idea." The lights flickered on and off. The hairs on Colin's arm stood on end and he felt a chill through his body. It was fear. He could feel massive amounts of fear in the room. He closed his eyes and opened his senses. In his mind the cell block sprang to life in frosty blue colors. And there was something else. A force of some kind, almost like a cloud. It moved quickly from cell to cell, whispering to the inmates. The fear in the room grew every time the cloud touched another cell. And then the temperature began to rise, the lights stopped flickering, and Principal Sampson appeared back in front of Colin and Terry. He was very red in the face and looked a little woozy. Every inmate in the prison was now cowering in fear at the back of their cell. One of the vampires was actually crying a little. "I apologize," said Principal Sampson. "I haven't done a haunting of that size in quite some time. You scared them, I could feel it." "I did. If you're an old ghost like me, you can haunt people. I'm not talking about slamming doors in the middle of the night or moving plates around in the kitchen. A true haunting reaches down into someone's deepest, darkest fears and brings them to life. That's what I just did to all the inmates. I warned them that if they don't listen to you and do what you say, I'll haunt them Forever. I have nothing but time after all. The ghost chuckled, and there was a dark gleam in his eyes in that particular moment, and Colin believed the man fully. Terry, said Colin, open the cells. Terry fiddled around with the console and started flipping switches. Bars began to retract into the ceiling. Let's meet the team, said Colin, stepping up to the first cell in the purple dragon. It crawled forward and sniffed at Colin's leg. This is Warzax, said Principal Sampson. He's actually half man, half dragon, but he's stuck in his dragon form. He can't figure out how to turn back. How do you know? I learned about all the inmates when I possessed the guard. Ghost trick, he said, tapping his head. Next, they visited the troll's cell. He was massive and smelled terrible. His thick gray skin seemed like that of a rhinoceros, and his huge head looked like a boulder upon a set of muscular shoulders. He squeezed his way out his cell and stood to his full height of almost 15 feet and stretched. This is Danseg, said Principal Sampson. He might very well be one of the last cave trolls in the world. They're simple folk but violent when provoked. And that, said Colin, pointing at the large tank of water in the cell next to Danseg. Yellow eyes peered out of the murky depths, and 2 black tentacles slithered out of the top of the tank. That is a kraken, a sea monster. The guards call him Norman. He was caught destroying fishing boats not far off the coast. And these two, said Colin, his head spinning a little. Ah yes, Monty and Albert. Vampires. They refuse to drink blood substitute, so they're imprisoned here. Nice to meet you, said Albert with a smile, though Colin could still smell the fear pouring off him. Colin kept his distance, knowing how vampires reacted to the smell of werewolves. And those, said Colin, pointing at a quintet of human-looking creatures. They all looked like larger version of Gareth Dugan, only their skin was yellowish and their eyes were large and dark. A tribe of ogres. They didn't want to integrate with the town. Great fighters, but they're greedy and smell like garbage. Colin looked down the block. A dragon, a cave troll, a small band of ogres, 2 vampires, a kraken, a telekinetic 10-year-old, a fire imp, a ghost, and Colin. Not the greatest army in the world, but it'd have to do. He tapped on Bernie's box. The little fire creature tapped back and smiled. Bernie, I'm going to let you out, but you can't burn anything. Unless it's a bad werewolf or a wizard with glowing red eyes. Do you understand? The little imp nodded enthusiastically. Do you really think he understood you? Said Terry. Colin couldn't explain how, but he knew the fire imp understood him completely. He does. He tore the lid off of Bernie's box, and the imp floated out and joined the army of creatures. Norman the kraken slithered out of his tank, 2 piercing yellow eyes glaring out from the mass of roiling rubbery black tentacles. He made a loud clicking noise as he moved and joined the group. Thank you everyone for agreeing to fight with us. A number of the group glanced nervously at Principal Sampson. We're going to head into town. We need to protect the people of Elkwood, so don't kill anyone. The group collectively looked sad. One of the vampires rolled his eyes. One of the larger ogres raised his hand. Yes, said Colin. What about these werewolves who are threatening the town? Said the ogre, his voice deep and cold. What about them? Can we kill them? Try to avoid killing them if you can. The group groaned, particularly the ogres. Norman clicked unhappily, his tentacles shaking. Colin thought of a compromise. But you can hurt them really, really bad, he suggested. The ogre smiled. Danseg the troll nodded his rock-like head, and Norman opened a wide, gaping mouth full of sharp teeth and grinned, such a terrifying grin that Colin suspected it would give him nightmares. There was just one final problem. Colin still couldn't change. If only there was a way I could get this stuff out of my blood. Then I could. Vampires. Yes, said Monty. Us, said Albert. Are you hungry? Asked Colin with a smile. Chapter 16. The Battle for Elkwood. Maybe Silas was right. Maybe I am going crazy, turning full werewolf. Wind rushed through his fur, and his clawed hands and feet kicked up dirt as Colin ran through the forest toward Elkwood. A normal person who wanted to get something out of their bloodstream would go to a hospital. But no, Colin's solution to getting the werewolf suppressant out of his body was to let 2 vampires suck his blood, on the theory that if his body were emptied of blood, his werewolf healing would kick in and replenish his body, and he'd be free of the chemical Sure, it had worked. But who does that? Not a normal person. But I'm not a normal person. I'm a werewolf. And I'm not crazy. Colin's change had happened moments after the vampires finished feeding, exploding out of him painfully as his body regenerated more blood and grew and stretched into his werewolf form. The other freaks had taken a step back at seeing the teenager before them transform into an 8-foot-tall wolf creature. None of them had actually seen a werewolf before. Monty and Albert had been more than happy to feed on Colin, despite Principal Sampson's protests. They had trouble getting close to Colin as the werewolf smell made them want to throw up, but once they had dug in their fangs one into each of Colin's wrists, they were fine. In fact, feeding on blood had thrown them into a bit of a frenzy, and the two vampires were itching for a fight. Getting out of the base had been easier than Colin suspected. They only had to knock out 2 guards. It appeared that Varsan had confined the rest of the soldiers to their rooms on one of the lower floors of the base. Colin had thought about speaking to them to try to convince them of what was going on, but they wouldn't have stood a chance against the rebel werewolf pack. As Colin charged along his familiar pathway, he could hear part his ragtag army following close behind. The ogres could move at a considerable speed once they got started. The vampires had been running so fast they were little more than a blur, so Colin had sent Monty and Albert and Principal Sampson on to check out the town, but to stay out of sight. Warzax the dragon was flying high above in the sky, happy to be free of the cage. Bernie was up there too, flying alongside him so as not to set fire to the forest. Danseg the cave troll had been a bit more of a challenge to get out of the base. While the elevator had been big enough to fit him, his weight put considerable pressure on the mechanics, and Colin was worried the elevator cables would break. But he made it up and out and was now thundering through the forest, knocking over the occasional tree as he went. Norman the Kraken had destroyed one of the base bathrooms and slithered down through the waterworks. Colin wasn't sure where the tentacled creature was, but Principal Sampson had assured him that krakens don't travel well over land. Terry rode on Colin's back and seemed to be having a great time. What would Silas think of all this? Colin wished his mentor were here. Being a leader was not something he felt comfortable with, and charging into a fight with a group of werewolves that had already kicked his butt once and a mad wizard with a hellstone seemed like a really bad idea. But if Colin didn't do anything, who else was there? His night watch uniform fit snugly, having stretched with Colin when he changed. He grabbed it on the way out of the base. At least this way he could turn into a human without worrying about clothing. The light of the full moon blazed down through the trees, throwing shafts of light across the forest floor. This final night of the full moon, Colin's werewolf side was very strong. He could feel it wanting to take control, to edge Colin to the back seat, but he had to keep control. If he had any hope of stopping Talbot, he needed to be able to put his inner wolf on a leash. He reached the edge of the forest, and Colin stopped and waited for everyone to catch up. Terry slid from his back and Colin stood up on 2 legs and stretched. He really wanted to howl at the moon, but he didn't want to alert the other werewolves. The cave troll lumbered out of the forest carrying a tree he must have accidentally run into. The ogres weren't too far behind and the dragon flew down and landed. Bernie also descended and floated next to Colin's shoulder. "What now?" said one of the ogres. Colin couldn't tell the ogres apart. They even smelled the same, and the smell was not a good one. Albert appeared in the middle of the group. His fangs were still extended and he had a sparkle in his dark eyes. Moments later, Principal Sampson floated down from the sky and the group took a step back. They were all still clearly terrified of the ghost and whatever he had done to them back at the base. Colin was thankful he had a ghost on his side. "The town hall meeting is in progress," said the ghost. "No sign of anyone with red eyes," said Albert. "The town seems quiet." "Where's Monty?" growled Colin. "He's not back?" asked Albert. Monty zipped into the group and stood with his hands on his knees, out of breath. Colin smelled blood. "Wolves," gasped Monty. "On the other side of town. They're making their way to the town hall." "Are you okay?" asked Colin. Monty stood up and Colin saw the vampire had claw marks across his chest. His ragged clothing was ripped and his pale skin was cut. "I'm fine. I'll heal. They're fast, these werewolves. I thought I was moving faster than they could. See, but one caught me." "It's a full moon," said Colin slowly, trying to wrap his wolf mouth around The words. They're going to be strong tonight and most of them, maybe all of them, will be a full werewolf. Their human selves might not be in control at all. Why aren't you like them? Asked one of the ogres. Colin didn't tell them that he wanted nothing more than to run and hunt right now. It took all of his willpower not to. I have more control over myself. The ogres nodded approvingly. Fight, said Danseg in a voice that sounded like rocks rolling down a hill. The cave troll was easily twice as tall as Colin and was idly stripping the branches off the tree he'd been carrying. Yes, said Colin. We fight but with rules. No humans can be harmed. Ah, said Monty with a grin. Not even a taste? Just a nibble, suggested Albert. We need to stop the werewolves before they reach town hall, said Colin, ignoring the vampires. There's a dark wolf with them bigger than the rest. We need him. He'll know where Talbot is. Can we kill the rest? Asked one of the ogres. Colin rolled his eyes. It appeared he'd assembled a bloodthirsty crew. Maybe. That's what was needed though. He knew how powerful werewolves were. He didn't want anyone to die. But if it came down to the people of Elkwood or a murderous werewolf, it was an easy choice. Spare them if you can, said Colin. The ogre seemed okay with the decision. Warzax coughed a smoke ring. The vampires nodded. Bernie was happily floating around in circles. So what's the plan of attack? Said Terry, who reeked of excitement. Apparently the only thing cooler to a 10-year-old than finding out your new friend is a werewolf is the prospect of running into a deadly battle. Colin had wanted to keep Terry at a distance, but Principal Sampson had convinced him otherwise, explaining that Terry was one of the most powerful telekinetics on record. He may be 10 years old, but he packs a punch. Colin remembered how the pack had surrounded him in the forest, hunting like wolves. He had to assume they'd do the same thing again. He had discussed his plan with Principal Sampson before leaving the base. Colin had tried to imagine what Silas would have done. Colin crouched down and, using his claws, scraped out a rough outline of downtown Elkwood, including the spot where Town Hall was located. He tapped the main street. We want to get them all here so they're contained. Monty and Albert blocked the north end. Ogres the south end. Danseg. The cave troll hoisted the tree onto his shoulder and stood up. Fight. I have a special place for you, said Colin. Warzax and Bernie give us support from the air. Principal Sampson and Terry, I want you at Town Hall. You're going to need to knock out Mr. Varson and explain the situation to the residents. Everyone clear. Howls floated from the direction of the town. It appears they've reached town, said Principal Sampson. Let's move, said Colin. The dragon leapt into the air with a great flap of wings. Bernie shot off after him like a firework. Monty hoisted Terry up on his shoulders and the vampires blurred away while the ogres charged off ahead. Principal Sampson turned to Colin. This is very brave of you. There's something special inside of you, Colin. Something different. And it's not just that you're a werewolf. Yeah, I might be going crazy too. Colin nodded to the principal. Keep Terry safe. I give you my word, said the ghost as he floated away. Danseg lumbered over and looked down at Colin with a questioning expression on his wide stony face. Fight now. Yes, Danseg. We fight now. Colin led the cave troll in a wide arc around the field so they could approach the town hall from the back. The wolves would cover the exit, so they'd need to force the pack to the front to keep the fight contained. I must be going mad. What am I doing? I'm 13. But it was too late for second thoughts. 2 werewolves Colin recognized from the forest were guarding the back door. He could smell the rest nearby, most of them around the front. With no soldiers to guard the meeting, the townsfolk were sitting ducks. He could hear Principal Sampson speaking inside. The 2 wolves heard Colin approach and turned growling, teeth bared. The wolf pup, said one. Lucky us, barked the other. Danseg lumbered out of the shadows behind Colin, casting a long shadow over the 2 wolves. What the he? The cave troll swung his tree like a golf club and launched both werewolves through the wall of the bakery next door. Nice swing, said Colin. Stay here. Colin entered Town Hall through the back door, cut through the small kitchen, and entered the main hall to the sound of gasps. Most of the residents of Elkwood were present, as they always were at the meetings. The only people not here were the humans who had no idea what Elkwood really was. The meetings were for the town's freaks and parents of said freaks. The people who saw Elkwood as a safe haven for themselves and their families. You all know Colin Strauss, said Principal Sampson from the podium. Our son lay unconscious on the stage. Terry stood near the main entrance of the hall, peeking out the window. There in the street, shouted Terry. Principal Sampson nodded. A man has come to Elkwood to destroy the town and has kidnapped Beatrice Strauss and Alfred Hamjackal, along with 2 students from the school. Most of the soldiers from the base are away, the rest are confined to the base. Colin and a group of prisoners are the only thing standing in the way of this threat. Colin gulped and stepped up to the podium, which seemed extremely small in comparison to his immense size. I know you are all in Elkwood because it's safe, he began. But that safety is being threatened right now. We've cleared the back door of Town Hall and can get you out that way. But I know there are powerful people among you. We are asking for your help. Fight with us. The crowd murmured. Mrs. Cross the vampire looked furious, but Colin couldn't tell whether it was because of him or because of all the werewolves. Outside the front door, there was a loud thump at the door followed by a snarl. Terry was standing a few feet from the door, his hands out in front of him. He was holding the door closed using his powers. Another thump and then another. I won't be able to hold them for long. No volunteers. Colin couldn't blame them. He'd hoped to get a few more fighters, but they were all scared. They were in Elkwood, so they wouldn't have to fight for their lives. Everyone out the back quickly, said Colin. And please don't be alarmed when you see the rather terrifying cave troll outside the back door, added Principal Sampson. He's on our side and is there for your safety. There was a mad rush toward the back of the building, and a clattering on the roof followed by the screech of a dragon and the whimper of a wolf. They're trying to get in through the roof, said Principal Sampson. Warzaks will keep them off. I will fight, said the voice of Mrs. Cross. She stood alone in the middle of the hall. I hate your kind, she spat. But you saved my boy Micah. I will fight for this town. Me too, said Mr. Dugan, Gareth's dad. And I, said Mrs. Saunders. She was the mother of a girl named Gillian whom Colin knew to be a half-demon. Colin smiled on the inside. Guard the townsfolk, he growled. Keep them safe. There was another crash at the door and a crack splintered across it. The hall was mostly clear, with Mrs. Cross bringing up the rear. Good luck, Colin, she said. Colin nodded and leapt across the hall, landing behind Terry. Stand back. Terry backed away and Colin listened. He could hear one of the werewolves charging at the door, picking up speed. Colin kicked open the double doors, caught the wolf by the throat, and flung him back into the street. Colin stalked out into the moonlit night and let out a long, mournful howl. All 20 werewolves were in the street. 2 of them were covered in white powder. They must have been the ones Danzig knocked into the bakery. The large dark wolf stalked forward and stood up on 2 legs. Step aside, wolfling, and maybe I'll just kill you quickly. You're not going to hurt anyone, said Colin. This is my town and you're not welcome. Get out, or I'll make you get out. The dark wolf barked a laugh. You and what army? Loud footsteps like the sound of trees being knocked to the ground could be heard as Danzig rounded the corner of Town Hall. Fight, said the cave troll. The 5 ogres rounded the corner at one end of the street and Monty and Albert appeared at the other end. The purple dragon dropped out of the night sky, flapped his leather wings and came to perch on the peak of Town Hall. Bernie floated down near Colin's shoulders and he could feel the raw heat coming off the little creature, so hot that it singed a few of the hairs on his shoulder. Mrs. Cross blurred into the street next to Danzig and Mrs. Saunders, her head completely on fire, also emerged from behind the building. Principal Sampson stepped out next to Colin along with Terry. This army, said Colin, and he could sense the uncertainty in the wolf pack, could smell their fear. This was more than they had bargained for. Kill them all, screamed the dark wolf, and the street erupted in chaos. Several of the wolves launched themselves at Danzig and the cave troll. Staggered back. The rest of the pack split off, half toward the vampires, half toward the ogres. The dark wolf stayed where he was, staring at Colin. Come on, wolfling. You're mine. Colin charged at the dark wolf and the 2 collided. Claws sliced through the air, jaws snapped and fur and blood flew. The dark wolf was strong and definitely bigger than Colin, but he wasn't smarter. His movements were vicious but clumsy. Colin ducked under a claw swipe that would have taken his head off and clamped his jaws around his enemy's thigh and pulled hard, throwing the dark wolf off balance. Colin could taste the blood in his mouth and felt anger and hunger run through him. He wanted to kill this wolf, to eat his heart, to end his life. Control, Silas had told him. Control is what separates the good werewolves from the bad. Colin tried to maintain control, but the more he fought, the more the dark wolf's claws ripped into his flesh, the more he wanted to end the creature for good. You're not crazy. You're not crazy. You're Colin Strauss. Colin flipped the dark wolf over and slammed him to the ground, but a foot lashed out and caught Colin across the stomach, and he felt the warmth of blood spill out. He staggered back and clutched his belly. The skin began to stitch itself together, but his opponent followed up with a claw to the face and Colin yelped. The dark wolf was too strong for him. The image of Becca's face flashed through Colin's mind. No, he snarled defiantly. The dark wolf growled a deep laugh. Look around you, you've lost. Colin looked down the street and saw the ogres were having trouble with two of the wolves. At the other end, Monty lay on the floor unmoving, while Albert, Mrs. Cross, and Mrs. Saunders stood with their backs together as three wolves stalked around them. Even Danseg was on his knees with two werewolves at his back. Warzax the dragon was pinned down. Terry, using his powers, was holding one of the werewolves in the air, but another was stalking up behind him. Bernie was throwing fire at another of the werewolves, but the creature kept healing up. Principal Samson was nowhere to be seen. And then Colin heard it. A slithering sound beneath the street, followed by a rhythmic clicking. You might have ogres, a dragon, a troll, and some vampires, said the dark wolf. But they're still no match for a pack of werewolves. Colin's wounds had finished healing and he stood to his full height. Yeah. But you forgot about Norman. Norman? Who's Norman? He's our kraken, said Colin. All the sewer covers along the block exploded into the air and clattered down on the pavement. The fighting stopped as a loud, high-pitched squeal erupted from beneath the street. Colin covered his ears, as did the rest of the werewolves. The sound was brutally piercing, and for a moment Colin thought his head might explode. The sound stopped. Three shiny black tentacles shot out of the sewer hole near the vampires, each one latching around a werewolf's leg, and dragged them down the hole. The werewolves clawed at the pavement, leaving grooves in the concrete before they disappeared down the hole. There were yelps and some horrible crunching, squelchy sounds, and then silence. Then more tentacles out of another hole. Then another, and more of the werewolves were dragged beneath the town. The two on Danseg's back leapt down and made a run for it, but a long tentacle grabbed both of them, coiling around their middles, and sucked them back underground. The remaining werewolves turned and fled. A couple of them almost made it to the end of the street, but it appeared Norman was very hungry. As the last of the pack disappeared beneath the street, there was a final round of crunching and squelching, followed by a long burp that sent a rumbling echo beneath the ground. Next time let's just lead with the kraken, shouted an exhausted-sounding Albert. The dark wolf stood, completely shocked at what had just happened. In mere moments the battle had turned completely. Principal Samson floated out of the ground and stood next to Colin. I'm sorry, my dear boy, for leaving the fight. I thought it'd be a good idea to go and find Norman. The poor thing had gotten lost on the way to town. Colin barked a short laugh, then turned his attention to the dark wolf. Where is Damon Talbot? I'll never tell you, growled the wolf. You can kill me for all I care. Kill you, said Colin with a snarl. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been haunted before? Chapter 17. The Fake Sorcerer. Colin raced out of town with Bernie blazing a line of fire through the air by his side. It had only taken a few seconds of Principal Samson haunting the dark wolf before he wet himself and told Colin that Damon Talbot was at Elkwood Cove. Colin had left the others behind. They were all pretty beat up and exhausted from the fight, and he didn't want any of them to get hurt any more than they already were. From the sounds of snoring coming from beneath the street, it seemed like Norman the Kraken had gone to sleep. He had, after all, just eaten 19 full-sized werewolves. Monty had lost a lot of blood but was otherwise okay. Mrs. Cross had assured Colin that he would heal. The ogres had taken off as soon as the fight was over, as had Danseg and Warzax. They likely didn't want to go back to their cells, and Colin couldn't blame them. He was probably going to get blamed for their escape at some point, but it was the last thing on Colin's mind. The Dark Wolf had said that Talbot was holding prisoners at the cove on the beach. He'd ordered the werewolves to kill the residents in the town hall and then Elkwood would be theirs. Principal Sampson had assured Colin that he'd take the Dark Wolf back up to the army base with the assistance of the vampires, and then he'd rally the soldiers and send them down to the cove. Colin hopped a wall and tore across a grassy field. He could hear the waves washing up against the beach and smell the salt water in the air. Elkwood Cove was a collection of small caves and a long beach that ran north until the cliffs took over. None of Elkwood's residents spent much time there, as it was almost always cold and raining. Some of the students from school occasionally had a campfire on the beach, but other than that, it remained deserted. Colin veered around to the south, where a rocky outcrop ran into the foamy swirl of the ocean. Staying low to the ground, he crept up the rock and peered over the edge down at the beach below. The scene there was a strange one. In the middle of the sandy beach stood Damon Talbot with his arms outstretched. His eyes glowed their usual red, and the hellstone around his neck was brighter than Colin had ever seen it. It sounded to Colin like he was chanting, and every so often he would stop and draw a symbol in the air with his hands and then push the symbol away where it floated in the air. There were already 4 symbols floating around the beach, each glowing bright red. Jeremy was tied up on a nearby rock but otherwise looked okay. Alfred, Colin's grandmother, and Charles the Demon sat tied back to back, not too far from Talbot. Becca stood next to them wearing a blank expression. She's under Talbot's control. How do I fix this? Colin crept back down the rock to where Bernie was waiting. The fire imp had been igniting small clumps of grass. Bernie, said Colin, I'm going to distract Talbot. I need you to stay out of sight and free the people on the beach. Burn through their ropes so they can get away. Do you understand me? The fire imp nodded gleefully and shot off back the way they had come. Colin stood and stretched and tried to prepare himself for what he was about to do. The full moon shone across the water and cast Colin's shadow against the rocks. His body ached from the fight with the Dark Wolf, and despite his healing powers he felt tired and weary. His inner wolf wanted to take control so badly, but his job wasn't over. Elkwood wasn't safe yet, and neither were his friends and family. Maybe he was going mad. He felt his wolf side tug at him to run away into the darkness and hunt and climb and be happy. But Colin couldn't ignore his human side. It was the side that kept him grounded, the side that reminded him who he was. He was a 13-year-old boy who was dating the girl of his dreams, who had a math assignment due on Monday and who just happened to have been bitten by a centuries-old werewolf. I am Colin Strauss. I'm a teenage werewolf. It's up to me to protect Elkwood, or die trying. If I'm being honest, I'd prefer to avoid the dying part. Colin turned and leapt off the edge of the rock high into the air and landed on the beach, his clawed feet digging into the wet sand. He threw back his head and howled long and loud. Talbot stopped chanting and turned to face Colin, a look of disgust on his face. You have got to be kidding me. My pack of werewolves couldn't beat you. I had a little help from some friends, said Colin. Your werewolf army is gone. Talbot turned back to what he was doing and began drawing another shape in the air. Doesn't matter. My spell is almost complete. I'm going to suck the power out of this old wizard and witch and that ugly demon, and then I'll be unstoppable. You hear me? Unstoppable. Colin stalked toward the wizard and wondered how on earth he was going to get the hellstone away from the man without touching it. A cave troll would be really useful right about now. Talbot reached inside his cloak and with a flourish produced a short, thin blade that shone in the moonlight. Silver. Why did it have to be silver? The scar along Colin's back where Mr. Winter had stabbed him with a silver blade tingled. Talbot handed the knife to Becca, who was still staring blankly. My dear, we appear to have a dog problem. Your werewolf of a boyfriend needs to be put on a leash. Be a darling and kill him for me. Becca's eyes flashed red for a brief moment and she walked past Talbot toward Colin. She's under his control. Gran, are you okay? This young punk has our magic bound and gagged. We can't help you, but you can. Stop him. He doesn't understand werewolves, not really. How do I stop him? Get that hellstone away from him before he finishes the spell. He'll lose all his borrowed power. What about Becca? I can't hurt her. She's under mind control, all you have to do is... Becca waved a hand and the voice in Colin's head went silent. She wiggled a finger at Colin and shook her head. Ah, no chit-chat, said Becca, her voice empty and strange. Please, Becca, I don't want to hurt you, pleaded Colin. I'll make this quick. Becca knelt down and shoved her free hand into the sand. Please, Becca, it's me, Colin. The sand beneath Colin's feet became softer and he sank a few feet. He tried to pull free, but the more he struggled, the more he sank. Quicksand. She's turning it into quicksand. Becca, listen to me, growled Colin, trying to form his words carefully. You know me, I know you. You're my girlfriend. This isn't you. Talbot is controlling you. Talbot laughed as he finished drawing another symbol in the air. Oh yes, it's all very tragic. You act as if I'm the bad guy here. You think you're not, spat Colin as he sank deeper. The sand was up to his chest, and as much as he tried to claw his way out, the sand enveloped him. Faster. Frustrated, Talbot stormed over to where Colin was now up to his neck in sand. He looked back at Becca with what seemed like admiration. That's very impressive, my dear. I didn't know you could do this. Tell me, said Colin, why aren't you the bad guy? Let me tell you why. It all started. Colin ignored Talbot completely. He was too busy watching a small flame that was floating near Jeremy. It disappeared behind his friend, and seconds later, he was free. Jeremy ducked behind the rock on which he'd been lying, and the little flame made its way, floating lightly through the air, to free the others. Becca now stood beside Talbot, silver dagger at her side, looking down at Colin, who was buried up to his neck and couldn't move. The heavy sand held him as firmly in place as concrete. And they threw me out like I was nothing, said Talbot. An all-powerful wizard like me cast aside all this raw power living right here in Elkwood. And they all want to just go to school and watch TV and be normal. Well, I'm here to do something about it. I'm going to put this power to good use. I'll be the most powerful sorcerer that ever lived. It came out as more of a bark, but Colin began to laugh. He laughed so hard that he began to worry that he might inhale some sand. But he couldn't help. What are you laughing at? Asked Talbot. What's he laughing at? He said to Becca, who stared down at Colin blankly. It's the power, blurted Colin. It does funny things. And then he laughed. Again. What are you talking about? In that moment it all made sense to Colin. Power was a dangerous thing to have. That's what Silas had been trying to teach him. The old werewolf had never wanted to tell Colin that werewolves were at their most dangerous in the first 6 months, and that a good majority of them went mad and turned evil. Instead, Silas had been teaching Colin all about control. All the training he'd been put through was about controlling the werewolf inside and not letting it take over. Because that's what too much power does. Takes over. That's what happened to Damon Talbot. He wasn't evil, he just felt betrayed. And had come into too much power too quickly. You don't control the power. It controls you, said Colin. The trick is to know that you're always in control. You're making fun of me? You don't think I'm in control? Why don't you ask your precious girlfriend here if she thinks I'm not in control? The hellstone burned a brighter red, and Colin could sense Talbot's anger. It's okay, Talbot, I get it, said Colin slowly. I was a nobody when I was turned into a werewolf, and then all of a sudden I had all this power. I could have done terrible things with it. I could have killed everyone in Elkwood already, but I didn't. Do you want to know why? I don't care if you don't, I'm telling you anyway. I didn't kill them because I'm not a murderer. I'm just a kid who got bit by a werewolf. I could take this as a curse, but I don't. As a gift, and I plan to make the very best of it. Because I control the wolf, it doesn't control me. Talbot threw his head back and laughed in such a dramatic fashion that Colin wanted to rethink his previous statement and just bite his head off. You're an idiot, said Talbot. Becca, kill him. Becca gripped the dagger in both hands and raised it above her head. Colin looked directly into her eyes and pushed his thoughts as hard as he knew. How? Becca, it's me, Colin. You don't want to do this. I know this isn't you. Know how strong you are. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You're a talented witch, and while some people think you're really dark and scary, I know that's not true. I know you like the color pink and that you fall asleep cuddling a stuffed unicorn. I mean, come on, how scary can you be? A smile twitched at the corner of Becca's mouth. Sure, you're a bit of a control freak, and if you knew that Talbot was controlling your mind right now, you'd be furious. But I know one thing is for certain, and that is that you're not a killer. You bring people back from the dead. You brought me back from the dead 6 months ago. Why would you go through all that trouble to just kill me again? Seems like a bit of a waste, to be honest, especially since I'm such a good kisser. Becca's arm shook slightly. What are you doing? Shrieked Talbot. Kill him. Just kill him already. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what being a werewolf is going to be like next week or next month or in 5, 10 or 20 years. All I know is what's right in front of me, and that's you. My Becca. Her hand shook and she dropped the knife in the sand, inches from Colin's nose. That was a little too close. This is ridiculous. Talbot pushed Becca to the ground and swept up the knife. If you want something done right, you have to do it yours. Where did everyone go? Colin's grandmother, Alfred, and Charles were gone. Good job, Bernie. You, shouted Talbot, his eyes blazing a fierce red. You did this. You think you've won, but all you've done is delayed the inevitable and killed yourself in the process. The silver dagger flashed in the moonlight as Talbot lifted it above his head. Nice speech, whispered Becca from where she was lying on the ground. She winked. Go get him. Colin felt a surge from beneath him as the sand began to shift and he was fired up into the air over Talbot's head, and then landed in a crouch on the soft sand. He shook his body, spraying sand. You think you're a match for me? Said Talbot with a laugh. I'm an all-powerful sorcerer. You're not a sorcerer. You're just a wizard with a hellstone. And from what I've heard, you're not that great of a wizard either. The color of Talbot's face was so red it almost matched his eyes. How dare you? I could turn you inside out with a flick of my fingers. I could change you into a snail and make you slither around. If I wanted to, I could. Wow, this guy talks too much. Muscles tensed, Colin sprang at Talbot with claws bared. The young wizard tried to twist away, but Colin's hands found what they were looking for. He gripped the chain holding the hellstone with both hands and tore it apart. The throbbing red stone dropped to the sand and instantly dimmed. The light went out of Talbot's eyes. He fell to his knees in front of the darkened stone and shrieked as if in pain. You're done, said Colin. You can't touch the hellstone without it killing you. No one can. You're an idiot, whimpered Talbot. You think it ends with me? Doesn't end. It will never end. You'll be sorry. You're going to regret. Colin punched him square in the face and Talbot slumped down in the sand. Thank you, said Becca. He never knew when to shut up. Tell me about it, said Colin. I think his true evil power is boring people to death. Colin lifted Becca off the ground and hugged her tight. The sky began to lighten and the sun crested over the horizon. Colin's body shuddered as waves of exhaustion washed over him. The hair shed from his body as he shrank back down to his human form. His snout retracted back into a mouth and his ears returned to their correct place on the sides of his head. His night watch outfit shrank along with him, and Colin was thankful to find himself not naked for once. Nice work, wolf boy, said Becca with a grin. Colin kissed her on the lips with as much passion as a teenage werewolf ever could. They kissed long enough that Jeremy emerged from his hiding spot and wandered over to them. Come up for air, let the girl breathe, Jeremy said, punching Colin lightly on the shoulder. Listen, Jeremy. About what just happened? What are you talking about? Asked Jeremy. You know, with me turning into a werewolf, Becca almost killing me, you being tied up, and the crazy wizard with the red eyes. Jeremy shrugged and then laughed. Colin, I have no idea what you're talking about. I think all the kissing might be affecting your brain. He punched Colin playfully again and walked over to where Talbot was lying unconscious. Colin looked at Becca, who just shrugged. That's Jeremy, she said. Oblivious, they said together. Colin heard a commotion coming from the direction of town, and moments later a group of people appeared at the beach entrance. A dazed Varson was accompanied by Principal Sampson, Colin's grandmother, and Alfred. Time to clean this mess up, I suppose, said Colin. Hey guys, said Jeremy. Look at this rock. The hellstone. Jeremy, don't touch it, it's in. But it was too late. Colin and Becca watched as Jeremy grabbed the hellstone. It feels hot, said Jeremy. The stone shone red, and for a split second Colin thought he saw fire in Jeremy's eyes. Then the stone began to crack and crumble, and blew away as dust on the morning wind. Did you guys see that? said Jeremy. Super weird, right? I'm going to see if I can find another one. He wandered off along the beach. Colin watched him go. Innocent and oblivious Jeremy. A good friend. A good student. And who knows what else? The cleanup of Elkwood took the rest of the weekend and everyone pitched in to help. A fight downtown involving a pack of werewolves, a giant troll, dragon, and so on did not go unnoticed. The rumors spread like wildfire and the norms in town began to panic. It took Alfred most of the next day to magic the entire town and bring a sense of peace back to Elkwood. Colin found the little old wizard later in the day sitting on the steps of Town Hall. He had a burning question that needed to be asked. Alfred, did you cast the spell on Jeremy? Such a nice young man. Yes, I'm the one who cast the spell to make him the way he is. He doesn't see anything unusual, said Colin. He was there for everything that happened on the beach last night, but to him it was like it never happened. Alfred stood up and stretched, his old joints cracking loudly. Look around. What do you see? Colin looked up and down the street. It was a normal Sunday evening in Elkwood. Some people were out for a walk. Others were getting in some last-minute shopping before the shops closed. I see people. The old man nodded. You see people going about their business like normal people do. They do that because I've told them there's nothing out of the ordinary about Elkwood or the people that live here. And that's good because if they knew that their kids went to school with a werewolf, they'd probably be scared. Or if they found out a cranky old blind woman controls the weather, they wouldn't understand. It's better that they don't know, said Colin. I get that, but what about Jeremy? He's not normal, is he? But he's still magicked like all the norms. The old wizard frowned. Jeremy is magicked far more than any of the normal folk. He can never know who or what he is. But why? Because, young Colin, sometimes it's better just not to know. He tapped the side of nose and winked, and then shuffled off down the street, leaving Colin with more questions than answers. After the entire town was put under a spell, yet again the freaks had to reconvene at the town hall so Varsun could offer an explanation. He stuck to the facts and didn't give away anything more than he had to. For someone who had been under the control of a mad wizard, Varsun managed to collect himself and did a good job of reassuring everyone that everything was back to normal, and that the man responsible for the attacks had been apprehended. Most people understood, and many of them expressed their appreciation to Colin. As they left Town Hall that night, the stories surrounding the Battle of Elkwood and Colin's involvement in capturing Damon Talbot were spreading. Some of the tales were highly embellished, but Colin didn't bother correcting them. He was being hailed as a hero, and the teenager in him loved the positive tension. But another part of him, maybe the werewolf side, knew that if it weren't for the prisoners from the base, or for Becca's and Principal Samson's help, he'd never have been able to defeat Talbot. The prisoners were a different issue. Albert and Monty had willingly surrendered and arrangements were being made for them to integrate into the town as a reward. They'd even agreed to drink the blood substitute that all the other vampires in town drank. Albert had taken quite a liking to Mrs. Cross, and it appeared that the feeling was mutual. Danzig had fled into the forest, but, being a giant lumbering creature, he was easy to track. Varsun had sent a team to bring him back to the base and had promised to find him a home where he could live in peace. Warzax the dragon had flown off. No one knew where he was and there was no way of tracking him. The same went for the ogres. Colin knew he could track them, as their smell was so strong, but he decided not to tell Varsun. The ogres had fought alongside him and he was grateful for that. Charles the demon had taken a real liking to Bernie and had been granted permission to keep the fire imp as a pet in his cave in the lower alternate dimensions of the army base, to which he had been returned. Bernie seemed more than happy, even though the little creature had been a little sad that he had to leave Colin. You can't stay with me, Bernie, said Colin to the grumpy fire imp. You'll end up setting something on fire. At least in Charles's cave you can burn things as much you want, and I promise to come visit you. Charles had thanked Colin for rescuing him and for his new pet, and returned to his home at the base. Norman the Kraken had to be lured out of the Elkwood sewer system by Principal Samson and was led out to the ocean, where he was released. Varsun had wanted to lock the Kraken back up, but after the sea monster had practically saved everyone in town by eating most of the werewolf pack, it seemed like the wrong thing to do. Principal Sampson assured Varsun that Norman would behave and live just off the shore of Elkwood Cove, keep a low profile, and had promised not to destroy any more fishing boats or eat people. After a long day of filling in the information gaps, cleaning up the mess, and being checked out by the medical team at the base, Colin and Becca were finally told to go home. You just saved the town from certain destruction, said Varsun. At the very least you deserve a hot meal and a good night's sleep. Colin couldn't agree more. His stomach growled to second the notion. Colin was told to skip school the next morning and report to the army base at 9 a.m. though Varsun wouldn't tell him why. Colin didn't really care at that particular moment, as his stomach was empty. After everything that had happened, he really just wanted to spend some time with two of his favorite people and eat a large meal. Aye, Captain, said Colin, took Becca's hand and headed home. Epilogue. A looming threat. Colin had spent most of the day with Becca while the cleanup was going on. She was upset she'd been used by Talbot, and felt guilty for whatever information she'd given him that had resulted in the kidnapping of Colin's grandmother, Alfred and Charles. You were under his mind control, Colin told her for the 17th time as they sat down to dinner. Colin's grandmother had insisted he invite Becca over. It had been a long week and she felt a good meal would help put the whole nasty business to rest. Somewhere deep down, Colin suspected it was her way of thanking Colin for rescuing her. You listen to that grandson of mine, she said. Even the best witch or wizard can fall under someone else's spell. But who knows how long he was controlling me, said Becca as she angrily buttered a dinner roll. You can't control everything, my dear, no matter how powerful you are. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes it just rains because it rains, said Colin with a grin. What does that mean? Said Becca, looking out the kitchen window at the overcast sky. I'll say this once, said the old witch, sitting down at the table. If not for you two, this town would have been destroyed and everyone who lives here killed, eaten, or worse. Whatever mistakes you think you might have made, you saved us all, and don't either of you forget it. The rest of the meal was pleasant with talk about school and when Becca's training with Colin's grandma would resume. Becca was keen to learn how to protect her mind, and the old lady assured her there were a few tricks she could teach her. Alfred had also agreed to teach her a few things as they shared a similar kind of magic. Mrs. Emerson picked Becca up after dinner, and Colin escaped to his room and spent some time updating his notebooks with everything he'd learned about being a werewolf. He wrote about his control issues dealing with the immense power that came with being what he was, and about understanding what Silas had been trying to teach him. There had still been no word from Night Watch or Silas, and Colin was worried. He considered going out for a late-night run, but it felt like he hadn't slept in days. Finally, he gave into exhaustion and fell into a deep sleep filled with dreams of werewolves past. A car from the base was waiting outside Colin's house at 8:30. He'd already eaten a hearty breakfast with multiple courses and had planned to run up to the base, but despite a solid night's sleep, Colin was still exhausted. He slipped into the back of the car, and the driver gave him a friendly nod in the rearview mirror. Colin watched Elkwood pass by as they drove. The days were getting warmer with summer approaching. Not that they'd see any sun. With his grandmother back in action, the sky was thickly overcast with dark clouds, and a light rain was falling. The base was bustling with activity when the car pulled up front. What's happening? Colin asked the driver. I don't know, I've been off duty, he replied sleepily. Head down to the second floor. They'll be in the boardroom. Colin got out of the car, entered the large warehouse, and took the elevator down 2 floors. He'd never been to the boardroom. Normally his meetings were in one of the offices or an interrogation room. A familiar scent tickled his nostrils as he stepped out of the elevator. Silas, I hear you've been busy. Colin practically ran down the hallway and burst through the boardroom's large wooden double doors. Principal Sampson stood off to one side with Mr. Emerson, who didn't look or smell quite as angry as he normally did. His right arm was in a sling. Varsun sat on one side of the table, his usual nervous self. Silas was leaning back in one of the chairs but jumped to his feet when Colin entered and gave him a big hug. Colin couldn't recall them hugging before, but he'd missed Silas so much, and he sensed the feeling was mutual. Because Silas bit Colin and turned him into a werewolf, they were joined for life as a pack, as a sort of family. Being A part had been difficult, like Colin had lost his arm or part of a leg. Now that Silas was here, back in Elkwood, a sense of comfort washed over Colin and he felt truly at ease for the first time since Seattle. Silas held Colin at arm's length. You look like you've grown. You look older, said Colin with a grin. Silas's hair was longer and his beard had a lot of gray hairs in it. There wasn't much chance to shave, said Silas, rubbing his face. What happened? First things first, said Mr. Emerson. Here we go. I want to thank you, Colin, said Mr. Emerson. Wait, what? Colin listened to Mr. Emerson's heartbeat. It was steady. He wasn't lying. Commander Varson and Principal Sampson filled us in on what happened while we were away. While you broke a lot of rules, including freeing some very dangerous Class 5s back into the world, you saved this town and the lives of its residents. You also saved Becca. Mr. Emerson looked down at his shoes, and the slightest smell of embarrassment floated off of him. I honestly can't think of a way to repay you. Colin's mouth hung open. Silas leaned over to him and whispered, You should probably say something. Colin snapped his mouth closed. Thanks. A lot of weird things had happened over the past week, but Mr. Emerson thanking him and meaning it was close to the top of Colin's weird things that happened over the past week list. Silas and Mr. Emerson sat down at the table. Colin was still a little in shock, but managed to place himself into a seat. We called this meeting for 3 reasons, said Varson, who looked like he hadn't slept all night. First, we wanted to fill you in on what happened to Night Watch. You couldn't be reached, said Colin, eyeing Mr. Emerson's injured arm. What happened over there? Having looked at all the evidence, we believe what happened in Seattle was part of an elaborate setup, said Mr. Emerson, shifting his arm in the sling. The werewolf attacks in Europe were meant to draw us away from Elkwood so Damon Talbot could attack the town and kidnap the soothsayer, your grandmother, and Alfred in order to steal their powers. If you hadn't stepped in his way, he would have undoubtedly succeeded and killed everyone in town. Nice work, kid. Colin smiled. Why didn't he just kill me? We think he didn't see you as a threat, said Silas. You're just a kid and he saw how easily he could manipulate you in Seattle. I think on some level he may have thought he could control you and use you in the same way he used Becca and Mr. Varson. Both Mr. Emerson and Varson tensed. Mr. Emerson was likely upset that Talbot had used Becca, and Varson embarrassed that he'd controlled him. He did for a while. He planted a spell in my head, sent my senses crazy. Thought it was because of Principal Sampson. No offense. None taken, my dear boy, said the ghost. Becca unraveled the spell. Magic is way more confusing than I thought it was. What happened to you in Europe? It was a trap, said Mr. Emerson. They were waiting for us. We were attacked and scattered. We lost 7 men from Beta Team. One of the creatures almost took my arm off. It was a mess, said Silas. I was the only Class 5 freak among a bunch of human soldiers, up against a pack of 40 werewolves. 40, said Colin. He'd had to enlist the help of vampires, ogres, a troll, and a very hungry kraken just to take down 20. We should have been better prepared, said Silas. How did you get out of there? Silas here fought his way out, said Mr. Emerson. I was captured along with the rest of the team and held at a farmhouse. 2 nights later, your mentor shows up and takes down the Alpha, their leader. Way to go, old man. Colin saw Silas's mouth twitch into a brief smile. The rest scattered, continued Mr. Emerson. We tried to hunt them but only managed to take down 3. We could have spent months hunting them across Europe. When we finally got communications back, we heard from Commander Varson and were on the first flight back here. Did Talbot help create all those werewolves? Asked Colin. That's a good question, said Mr. Varson. Which brings us to the second reason we called this meeting. We think you can help us answer that question. Me? How? We've been interrogating Talbot, but he won't crack. We had a number of people try to read his mind, including your grandmother, but he has so many magical blocks up that it's impossible. Your grandmother did threaten to fry him with a bolt of lightning, and even that didn't convince him to talk, said Mr. Emerson. Principal Sampson even tried his haunting trick on him, and it didn't faze him in the slightest. Most embarrassing, said Principal Sampson. Why do you think he'll talk to me? Asked Colin. Because he told us that you're the only person he'll talk to, replied Varson. Colin followed Mr. Emerson back down the hallway. He had so much he wanted to ask Silas, but the group insisted he speak with Talbot first. They took the elevator down several floors, and Colin was surprised when they passed the cell block level. He's not being held in the base prison? Talbot is too dangerous for that. We have another cell block for magical types. Alfred helped us build it. It dampens magical power. We keep the more dangerous inmates down there. The elevator stopped at the 23rd floor. The doors opened and Colin saw the difference immediately. This was no prison like the one above, with clean white floors and shiny metal bars. The 12 cells here had been carved out of rock. Instead of bars, each cell had a thick see-through wall with air holes drilled at even intervals in several lines across the length of each frontage. Mr. Emerson stepped aside. He's in the last one on the left. I'll be right here. Colin stepped out and walked over the uneven rock floor. Most of the cells were empty. The third cell on the right contained a tall, scruffy man with shaggy black hair and bright yellow eyes. He sneered at Colin. The smell was unmistakable. This was the dark wolf, now in human form. Those bright eyes followed Colin as he walked by, and the smell of anger and hate was impossible to ignore. Damon Talbot sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell. Gone were the fancy clothes and sweeping cape. He wore a plain blue shirt and pants, the same as the rest of the inmates. His long hair hung around his shoulders, and he looked thinner than when Colin had fought him yesterday. Talbot's eyes were closed and encased in dark circles. A large bruise painted the right side of his face. A lovely dark bluish-brown, likely where Colin had punched him. It was interesting to see now that Talbot was only maybe 10 years older than Colin. He'd looked older and far more in control when he was in possession of the Hellstone. Talbot's eyes snapped open and focused on Colin. The young werewolf, the savior of Elkwood, king of the freaks. You wanted to speak with me? Actually, I want to kill you, but yes, speaking with you will have to do for now. Colin said nothing, partially because he didn't know what to say and partially because there was such a steadiness to Talbot's heartbeat that it scared Colin a little. I assume the old folks told you my story. Something about me being power hungry, I imagine. They're not wrong. Crave power, and really, what's this? Life without power? Colin noted the crazy look in the man's eyes every time he said the word power. They were afraid to teach me more, you see, so I looked elsewhere for what I craved. And I found it. There's that look again. Poor guy. That Hellstone must have twisted him up. Colin couldn't help feeling a little pity for the man. Talbot stood and stepped up to the glass, his hands folded behind his back. What you said to me back on that beach, continued Talbot, that you control your power, that it doesn't control you. It won't last. You'll want more. I won't, said Colin. I'm not like you. You're just like me, snapped Talbot, spittle hitting the glass. It was difficult to block out the scent of the other werewolf, but there was something strange coming from Talbot that Colin couldn't place. He was angry. Absolutely. But there was something else, almost excited, maybe even a little nervous. Get to the point. What did you want to tell me? Asked Colin. Talbot smiled and resumed his calm composure. You're aware that Elkwood isn't the only town of its kind, yes? Colin nodded. He remembered Becca and Varson had both mentioned other towns, and that the other towns also contain exceptional creatures such as yourself. Yes, said Colin, unsure of where this was going. The man who gave me the Hellstone isn't just exceptional. He's amazing. He's purely evil. And he won't stop until he's drained every single town like Elkwood of every drop of power they contain. He'll soon learn that I failed here, and he'll come for you and your friends, and there's nothing you'll be able to do about it. Talbot's heartbeat was perfectly steady. He wasn't lying. Either what he was saying was true, or he was so crazy he believed it to be true. And when the time comes, he continued, when your friends are dying around you, when everything you've come to love in your precious little town falls to ruin, that's when you'll come to me for help. You'll walk right up to this cell and ask me, Damon Talbot, to help you. You're crazy, said Colin. Why even tell me all this? Talbot barked that irritating little laugh. For a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the only thing you're going to remember is that when things turn bad, you'll feel an overwhelming need to ask me for help, and that our recent conversation just now was nothing more than me wasting your time. Talbot's heart rate suddenly increased. Colin took a step back from the cell. He's up to something. And secondly, despite what those fools upstairs believe, this cell doesn't completely dampen my powers. I've still got enough juice left for one final trick. A smirk spread across Talbot's thin face and Colin realized too late what was happening. No, shouted Colin. In one quick movement, the wizard threw a floating symbol similar to the ones he'd created on the beach but much smaller and not nearly as bright. A spell. The spell passed through the glass. Colin jerked out of the way, but the spell shifted directions and slammed into his chest. He felt a strange warmth spread through him and his senses faded in and out. Colin, are you okay? Shouted Mr. Emerson as he charged down the wide hallway. What was happening? He'd been talking to Talbot, but it was a waste of time. Then he'd felt dizzy. Mr. Emerson gripped Colin's arm and his senses snapped back into focus. What happened? Asked Mr. Emerson. What did he say? Is the poor boy okay? Asked Talbot. I'm fine, said Colin. His head felt a little fuzzy, but he was otherwise okay. Just too much excitement, I guess. Mr. Emerson glared at Talbot, who was grinning like an idiot. He doesn't know anything, said Colin. He was just wasting our time. Mr. Emerson led Colin away toward the elevator. Talbot's voice floated down the cavernous prison hallway. See you again real soon, Colin. He didn't tell you anything? Asked Varson after Colin and Mr. Emerson had re-entered the boardroom. No. He admitted he was wasting our time. If he knows anything, he didn't want to tell me. Well, it was worth a try, shrugged Principal Sampson. You mentioned there was a third reason you called this meeting, said Colin. Ah, yes, said Varson. Silas. Silas stood up and placed a hand on Colin's shoulder, his amber eyes staring intently. You've more than proved yourself these past few days, and we now realize that Talbot was responsible for your sudden change in Seattle. We're making some changes to Night Watch, and we want you to be a part of it. If we learned anything in Europe, it's that the kind of things we hunt are too dangerous for humans. What are you saying? We're ungrounding you, said Mr. Emerson. We want you to rejoin Night Watch effective immediately. No more babysitters, said Silas. And no more humans. It's too dangerous for them. For now it's just you and me and Principal Sampson. But Varson and Emerson would like us to recruit and train some new members. Maybe a useful kraken, or a cave troll, or a teenage witch you might know. His old eyes creased at the edges as he smiled. Colin didn't know what to say. He was ecstatic, as he was sure the grin on his face was plainly showing. Say something, Colin. Say anything. Anything at all. I'm in. Silas walked Colin out of the base where a car was waiting to take him to school. Rain was falling in a light drizzle. Your grandma's back to work then, said Silas. Seems like it. Talbot really had nothing to say? Asked the old wolf. Colin shook his head. Nothing. It's a shame. It'd be great to know where he got the Hellstone. Charles says they're rare. Some demon stole them from Hell centuries ago, but they were believed to be lost. There are more of those things out there? Silas nodded. Maybe we'll run into someone else with a Hellstone. Are you ready for that kind of a fight? It's not just going to be werewolves we're up against out there. Are you kidding? Said Colin. I'm ready for anything. That's my boy. Colin turned to get into the car, but a breeze blew through the trees and the smell of the forest floated through the air. He looked back at Silas. Feel like racing back to town? Silas laughed. You think you can take me down, wolf pup? One way to find out. Silas tilted his head as if considering the challenge, and Colin thought for a moment that he wouldn't take the bait. Go, shouted Silas. And then the old werewolf was gone, racing across the base toward the fence on the cliff's edge. Adrenaline surged through Colin's body as he pursued his mentor across the wet concrete. He caught up to him as they both reached the fence and leapt high into the air, over the fence, over the edge of the cliff, and down 50 feet to the forest floor, where Colin landed fully changed into werewolf form. The forest loomed before him, casting dark shadows across the ground. Colin charged forward through the trees ahead of Silas, letting out a howl of excitement as he ran, with a single thought ringing through his mind. I love my life.